Well, the Press Club of Southwest Florida is proud to present one of the nation's leading journalists, Terence Smith, who was a colleague of mine and who I got to know in Washington, and was very proud to know him. We are also here to promote a book. I'll spare Terry the salesmanship, but this is a great book. I've just read it, and it's easy to get on Amazon. When I think of Terry Smith, I think of someone who has won, in racetrack parlance, the Triple Crown of American journalism. He has worked for the New York Times, the epitome of print journalism, of course, and then on to CBS News, which is the gold standard of broadcast news. And then finally, he capped his career at my alma mater, the NewsHour with Jim Ware, where Jim often said, "We dare to be boring, and we have a whole hour to prove it to you." Terry was the media correspondent and observer and critic, and he was never boring. And as you are about to discover, he's not boring, and neither is the book. So, Terry?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. It's actually my first time down here. I am staying with Greg and his wife, Mary Leonard, and I want you to know it's a very civilized household in Bonita Bay, because when I came out this morning onto the kitchen counter, I found 3 print newspapers delivered every day to their door. So that's a distinction. So anyway, so thank all of you at the Press Club. I think it's great you have this Press Club. And Brianna, where are you? Good for you. Keep going. I think that's great. I have some images here that I will share with you and go along and just try to give you a little flavor of what's in the book. It's a shameless promotion, of course. My friend and longtime editor, Peter Osnos, said to me, "You have to be shameless because nobody is going to love your book the way you do." So plan on it. So here it is. You can get it through Amazon and there's some promotional flyers here that Greg has over here that offers it for 30% off from the publisher. But we won't take too long. At some point, get the hook and tell me to shut up. And if you have some questions, we'll be happy to take those as well. As you know, particularly in this club, journalists are very modest, shy people who don't like to talk about themselves. But somehow I have overcome that in this book, which is something of a COVID creation, because I had doodled on it after retiring from the NewsHour, and then suddenly, COVID, March 2020, my calendar was cleared, but I had no excuse anymore. So I finished it, and it came out October 15th. It is based on a 5-decade career in daily journalism that spanned 20 years with the New York Times, 13 with CBS, including Phil Jones, right here, one of your members, and went on to PBS, Greg's shop. He was the brains of the operation at the NewsHour, and altogether a great great exercise. The book opens in, well, here, let me show you. See if I've got this one. Yeah. It opens in June of 1967 in Jerusalem, Israel. In my opinion, one of the truly magical cities on earth. And I had arrived there as a boy foreign correspondent on his first overseas assignment. I got there 10 days before the war. And I knew nothing. And so, Brianna, just roll with it. When you get a good assignment, take it and run with it. And mine was a good assignment. It was, I was staying here in the King David Hotel, which I bet many of you know. And it overlooks the no man's land between West and East Jerusalem. And it was there on the morning of June 5th, 1967, that I was awoken by a phone call with a hangover from a party the night before that the foreign press had. And it was a party given because that afternoon, Sunday afternoon, June 4th, Moshe Dayan, then the defense minister of Israel, and a famous soldier, had announced at a press conference that Israel was going to give diplomacy more time. Well, my advice is, whenever a military man says that, go for the shelters right away. Because, of course, the next day, on a very hot, dry morning, the war began. And it, 6-day war, took 6 days. It was extraordinary. And my part of it, as the new boy, was the battle for Jerusalem, which turned out to be an epic event and a wonderful story. And the battle was launched on the morning of June 5th, and by June 7th, the Israeli soldiers, including these, had arrived at the Western Wall on the east side of Jerusalem, and we followed. I and a couple of others followed in behind them. There was no great fighting. Actually, the Arab Legion of Jordan had withdrawn because in the face of the Israeli attack. This wonderful photograph at the foot of the Western Wall, Wailing Wall it was known in those days, is the wall, the retaining wall of the Second Temple that was destroyed in 70 AD and is the holiest site in Judaism. But the history and the significance of this, and this photograph captures it. It was taken by my friend David Rubinger of Time magazine, was that this was the first time Jews had been in control of the Wailing Wall or Western Wall and the Temple Mount in 2,000 years. And it was the first time that Israelis had been able to get there in 19 years, since 1948, when the city was divided by the war. So it was an amazing moment. It was another hot, dry day, and we got over there in the late morning, went around to the east side, came in the walled old city through the gate, and it's called the Lion's Gate. You can see the Garden of Gethsemane behind it, and you can see actually the Mount of Olives right through the gate. So we came in there that morning. The reaction of the Israeli soldiers who got into this place that they could not have reached was very interesting. Some, like these three, were quite moved. Some danced a hora around the base of the, some kissed the wall and put messages in there, and others, non-observant, completely unmoved by the whole thing. And they just want to find some shade. It was a very hot morning. And it kind of reflected the state of Israeli society then. 53 years ago. This famous photograph, that's the Lion's Gate, that's the Garden of Gethsemane behind it, the Mount of Olives. And this is a very famous picture. The backstory that I want to share with you is how it came about. On the left, you have Uzi Narkis. He was the commander of the Jerusalem district. In the middle, of course, Moshe Dayan with his eye patch, quite recognizable. And on the right, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the chief of, the commanding officer of all the forces at that time. The three of them had arrived outside the old city, and they stopped and they waited there while their press people got cameramen and television cameramen and photographers and everybody in position inside. This is by now 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And then when everybody was set, these three strode in that picture. And so a little sense of PR even in wartime and in that situation. I had learned about the outbreak of the war, as I mentioned, with a phone call. It came from a friend, Michael Elkins, BBC correspondent, who called me first thing in the morning, and he had extraordinary contacts in Israeli intelligence. And he said, this is it. This is the real deal. This is full-scale war. And what he actually said to me was, get your ass out of bed, Smith, and get going, because this is a big deal. So anyway, that went on, and it was an extraordinary 6 days, and as you might imagine, a bath for a brand new foreign correspondent. That was this page 1 there, that you can see and maybe read, of that day, June 7th. And it's interesting, I'm going to skip through some of this because it takes too long, but Israelis and Jordanians or Palestinians have been separated for 19 years. They were fascinated by each other, and they discovered each other in the months after the war. Israelis poured into the souk and alleys like this in the old city because, among other things were cheaper there. And you could get, transistor radios and things like that without an excise tax. It proved to me that the human desire for a bargain trumps anything. But in the course of it, the Israelis discovered that Palestinians were not all cutthroats, and Palestinians discovered that Israelis were not 10 feet tall. They were people, and they got along. They all thought there would be peace within a few months. The victory had been so total. And of course, now, 53 years later, we're in largely the same situation. The city is still divided. But then along at Camp David, Jimmy Carter brought Anwar Sadat on the left and Menachem Begin together for the Camp David Accords, and it led at least to peace, which there is to this day between Egypt and Israel, and subsequently Jordan and Israel. So I'll tell you why I've skipped a year ahead to June 5th also, 1968. That picture you probably recognize of Robert Kennedy. He's won the California primary Ethel standing next to him, looking very tan. And he finishes his little remarks there. It's about midnight California time. And he says, on to Chicago, the convention in Chicago. And of course he goes into the kitchen, as you well know, and is assassinated there by Sirhan Jr. So I'm, 10,000 miles away in Israel when I heard the news. And I had covered this guy in his only successful or complete political campaign for the New York Herald Tribune. I had covered him in 1964 when he ran and won the Senate from New York. And I was skeptical of him at first, frankly, but I came to admire him. I came to think that his commitment to racial justice and civil rights and equity was the real deal. So I was shocked, as anybody would be. I went the next day to a reception at the home of the American ambassador in Herzliya, Israel. And he takes me into his study and closes the door and says, the assassin of that act, Sirhan Jr., is from a village just outside Jerusalem. And his father, Sirhan Sr., is still there. And that's all he had to tell me. And I went immediately to that man's house. I got there at 10 o'clock at night, that same night. It was dark, the house was dark. I rapped on the door, and a slight man in his pajamas turned on a light, came down, came to the door. And I told him who I was. I was a reporter from the New York Times. I don't know what he thought. Who's this person coming 10 o'clock at night to his house? So, but Palestinian hospitality, he invited me in. I had to make coffee. I have to have coffee. So we had the coffee, and he was still puzzled, I'm sure, why I was there. And I asked him, had he heard that Robert Kennedy had been assassinated? And Sirhan Sr. said, yes, he had heard. It was terrible that Kennedy could have been a president. I said, okay. Did you hear that the assassin was caught on the spot? Yes, he said, I heard it on the radio. Still no reaction. So I said, did you hear the name of the assassin? He said, no, I went to bed. You know. So he it's still very vivid memory. So anyway, I had a reporter's notebook on the kitchen table, and I pushed it over, and I asked him to, I said, do you have 5 sons? And I asked him to write down the names of his sons. So he did. He wrote the names, and the 4th name in the list was Sirhan Jr. So I put my finger on that name, and I said, that's the assassin. He looked at me. His eyes were wide. And then he could see I was not kidding. This was not a joke. And first he said, it's not possible. He was the best of the boys. The best grades, the brightest. I had the highest hopes for him. And then he would switch. He would emotionally go the other way. And he said to me, but if he did it, he should hang. And back and forth he went, revealing to me that he was a very unstable character. Back and forth he went like that for the rest of the night. So I went home and I wrote the story for the Times, and it was in the paper. There's the mugshot of Sirhan Sirhan Jr. of 53 years ago. That was the 64 campaign. And there's a postscript, though, to the story. The next day, the ambassador had told me not only where the father lived, but where the boy had gone to school, a private school in East Jerusalem. So I went to the school and interviewed the headmaster. And I learned that, yes, the boy had been a good student. Yes, he had gotten good grades, seemed to have a lot of promise. But the headmaster said, you may not know, it was a very troubled family. The father lost his job when the Israelis won in 48. And he was bitter. And he took it out on his wife and his children, his boys, and he beat his wife and he beat the boys. And the mother seized the opportunity from a Christian, they were Christians, evangelical group, and moved the boys to California. And that's why Sirhan Sirhan Jr. was there and in a position to do what he did. The final postscript, you know that he recently came up for parole. The California Parole Board voted that he should be eligible for parole under the California system. It went up to the governor, Gavin Newsom. He rejected it. And so he continues in jail. But the California parole legislation provides that he must be brought up again for possible parole within 18 months. So this story is not over, and process goes on. What to do? It's 1:10 here. I could, well, let me tell you, I want to tell you one more story. So I move on to Southeast Asia. I'll explain what this is about. That's the Hotel Royale in Phnom Penh. And I was the Southeast Asian correspondent in 1968, based in Bangkok. Got a chance to go over to Cambodia and to see the world that had been closed to the Western press for some years. And that fellow, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the head of Cambodia, who was quite a character, he basically conducted a 30-day news conference. He took us all around the country, took us to Angkor Wat, he took us down to Sihanoukville on the Gulf of Thailand, and it was all around, and he was a character, and much of it would take place here in, in the back. There's a garden behind the Hotel Royale, a big garden, and cocktails would be served out there. It was a wonderful place. You could go there, and you would be surrounded at all these tables by spies and crooks and reporters and Sihanouk lovers, and everybody's keeping an eye on everybody else. It was quite a scene. But in a final interview at the end of my month-long stay there, I sat down with Sihanouk and we talked about Vietnam, wall that was developing in the country immediately next door. And he said, I'm going to read you 2 sentences from that interview, which I published in the New York Times on November 17, 1968. And as you listen, substitute the word Afghanistan for the word Vietnam. He said this, quote, "You will be forced to take your troops and leave Vietnam. You cannot block the majority will. You cannot stop the reunification and, yes, the communization of Vietnam. The majority of the people want to be with Ho Chi Minh, and there is nothing you can do about it. You would, and here's the key, you would be wise to withdraw and let the Vietnamese settle their own problems themselves. November 17, 1968, 7 years before we took his advice at the point of a gun. Tens of thousands of lives, of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives, and it was all there. And it was read by, I'm sure, Nixon and the administration and ignored. And it raises questions about journalism and journalists and what we do. And, there are two ways to look at it, right? You can say, what's the point? You report something like that and, it goes on without regard. Or you can say, well, at least you raise that side of the argument. And you raise it from, in this case, a highly authoritative voice, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who knew what he was talking about. But it does raise that question. That question came up again and again in Vietnam, where Phil Jones was for CBS. You'd go and cover a battle and report on it, and be in the paper the next day or on CBS. The world would go on, the war would go on. What's the point? It's a provocative question that doesn't lend itself to an easy answer. Sihanouk was a character, I will tell you. He's shaking hands with, these are 11 American servicemen who got blundered up the Mekong River on a naval boat and got captured. You may remember this, Phil. And they were held for about 4 or 5 months, but let me tell you, their captivity was not too bad. On Independence Day, he got them into these white suits, and he treated them to a fine day. They came to the Independence Day ceremonies in Phnom Penh. It's all for PR, obviously. He's trying to show them off and say, here's my leverage. And then he had them, they had a fine lunch at one of the excellent French restaurants in Phnom Penh. And then they were taken to one of the better brothels on Sihanouk's tab. And shortly thereafter released. So it was a pretty good captivity. That's Vietnam, but look, it's 1:15. You tell me what to do.
Q&A or keep going?
Keep going.
If anybody has to leave, please do, but let's go another 10 minutes, if you don't mind.
I don't mind, but I'm trying to be alert to your schedule. This picture is Saigon. Phil, look familiar? Yeah. Who else was there during the war? Soldier? Reporter?
Reporter. Soldier.
It was a beautiful city. Wonderful. Gorgeous women. Fabulous food. Just happened to be nonstop war. And this is kind of what it was like at one point, including, you'll both appreciate, Phil, look at the cloud of smoke from the cyclos, the motorbikes in the background. That was the palace where I was telling people at this table that I brought my wife and infant daughter with me to Saigon because the security situation had improved. And we got a house on Windsor Street right across from this, the presidential palace, which had a guard. I thought, well, that's pretty good. And just down the street was the twin spires of the Saigon Cathedral. I thought, well, I presidential palace. I've got the Lord just down the block. What could go wrong? Well, a lot. What I didn't know was that the Viet Cong, who would set up mortars and rockets in a very crude arrangement across the Saigon River, used the twin spires and the antenna on the presidential palace as kind of Kentucky windage. And so the mortars would land in the street in front of our house. My 18-month-old daughter thought it was very cool. She'd say, boom. Her first words. Anyway, there's a lot about Vietnam, and that's, of course, now, you see, that's a North Vietnamese tank has moved in. That's 1975 in the palace. Those wonderful C-130 gunships would lay down suppressive fire and protect Saigon. This is yet another story that I'll skip over. In Vienna, when, as usual, I was out of it and didn't know about a hostage situation. And then this picture shows you Israeli troops. This is now the 1973 Yom Kippur War. I was back there covering it again, and it went on as the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal, as you see right there, some sort of temporary bridge, and came into the Sinai and succeeded in rolling the Israelis back for 2-3 days before the tide turned. This amazing photograph taken by my friend Michael Baran is on the east bank of the Suez Canal. That's an Israeli soldier there on the left who's been taking names of Egyptian prisoners, and a mortar, a shell goes off from the Egyptian side, obviously, and lands right there. And Mika had the presence of mind to take that photograph, which I simply don't comprehend how he could do it. And then the fourth war in the title was the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. This is Nicosia in 1974. And it was small potatoes compared to Vietnam and the Arab-Israeli wars, but it was just as hairy, I'll tell you. And of course, those Turkish soldiers took over 40% of the island or more. It's still today. I mean, everything I covered surely was going to change, and it didn't change. And this is Cyprus today. That's a rough map there. And the Turks still control that darker portion. I remember George Shultz, the former wonderful Secretary of State, once said to me, there are two kinds of problems in this world. There are problems you can do something about, and you try. And there are some that you really can't solve. All you can do is manage them. And I said, what's an example of the latter? He said, Cyprus. In effect, you break your pick on that one, trying to solve it. But it goes on and on. And what you've got to do, I'm afraid, is buy the book and read it, because we haven't got time to go through all the rest of it. There's himself gets to CBS News. Remember that microphone there, film on the West Wing? And I cover, that's my father. Picture of him. Red Smith, the sports columnist, in his day the most widely read in the country, and no doubt the notion, or his experience anyway, inspired me to go into the business in the first place. Not directly, but he never urged it, but of course it did. That was the first of the 5 presidents. there with the wily Henry Kissinger, who is still alive, who brought out a book just recently. I mean, good Lord. I don't know, I have to look him up. He's 96 or something, you know. This is a fun thing, just very briefly, from the White House tapes. Kissinger was a good source, but he always denied he was a source. And on this occasion, Nixon is seriously pissed off at something I'd written. I don't recall what. And Kissinger is trying to persuade him that he was not the source, that then the Secretary of State, William P. Rogers, his rival, was the source. And so, believe it or not, they sit there and they talk, and this is all in the White House tapes. This is all public now, thanks to Alexander Butterfield. And Kissinger says, first of all, Terence Smith, he's talking to Nixon, never calls my staff. Well, not true. He's never done it in all the years we've been here. Absolutely not true. Secondly, my staff is on additional instructions not to return any New York Times calls whatsoever. True, but largely ignored. And so Nixon, who's now really annoyed, that's right. And Kissinger says, so that's out of the question that I'm the source. It's just unbelievable. In the tapes, you see, they would spend 2 hours talking in the Oval Office on a presumably busy day, talking about their press coverage. I mean, give me a break. This guy was the second president I covered. Without question, one of the most intelligent, hardworking guys, but not without the skill he needed to get himself reelected and into a second term. And there he was on a press plane talking to us. We flew on Air Force One, tens of thousands of miles. Those were the press seats. It was, it was not first class, I'll tell you that. I went with Mondale all around Asia, and we had a wonderful time. And we arrived at our last stop in Wellington, and there was a crowd, and they were holding up signs. And Mondale came back. We'd been kidding him. You could kid Mondale, a politician with a sense of humor. And he said, oh, look, I'm big here. I'm really big in Wellington. In New Zealand, he was going to meet with the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Muldoon, that guy who was known universally to the Kiwis as Piggy Muldoon. So we got close to the signs, and I'll end on this note. We got close to the plane, loaded up, we could finally make out these signs that a crowd is holding, and they said, read, Mondale Muldoon, a close encounter of a turd kind. a little sense of down under humor. Anyway, so gotta stop. The other guys, these are all stories. And then Reagan and Gorbachev. I covered all their summits. That's in Geneva. That's in Reykjavik, Iceland. And let me tell you, they don't call it Iceland for nothing. And that is effectively the end of the Cold War, right there. Moscow, 1988. Now, maybe the Cold War is starting up again. Yeah. Who knows? And so, these are all things. You remember that moment, I suspect. Certainly affected his, and then I covered this fellow's decision to run for president and try to succeed his father and outdo him by winning 2 terms rather than just one. And so those are the 4 wars and 5 presidents, but there are a lot of stories in here if you want. And we have these promotional flyers if you want them. You can order from the publisher, 30% off, or you can just dial it up on Amazon. It comes in a day or two.
All right, 5 questions we're going to take before we say goodbye to Terry Smith. Couple questions?
Sir?
Yeah, I'm curious what you think. So the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal all have excellent online newspapers, if you will. Is that the future? I mean, they seem to be, all of them anyway, and I know each one has a special niche, but for the rest of the country, small papers around here and everywhere else, is that the future we're looking at?
Absolutely, it's the present. I mean,
But can you make
there are
money?
ancients like me, and maybe some of you, still get this on your doorstep. But fewer and fewer. The New York Times, and this is directly to your question, this week, was it announced, or last week maybe, that they had achieved 10 million subscribers, almost all of whom are digital, paying so much a month. That they reached that 3 years before their goal. So they're making money again. Stock's up, Mary. She doesn't even know what it doesn't. Check the stock price. But across the country, as you say, 2,100 local newspapers have folded since 2004. Brianna, it's a different world out there. But the good news is many serious, substantive websites have opened and are covering the news, if it's Politico or Axios or whatever. And so it's a changing world for sure, but it's not hopeless. I don't think so.
Next question? Joe?
Yes, please.
You're so obviously dedicated in your reporting to truth and accuracy. There's so much misinformation today in the media. How can we get back to that sense of accuracy and truth?
We haven't lost that sense of accuracy and truth, but it is harder and harder to find. They talk about media literacy, right? You need now, you the reader, the viewer, the subscriber, you have to exercise the gatekeeping, editing, truth and false decision that editors once did for you, hopefully correctly. And now you have to decide, is this bull or is it the facts? And that's very hard for people who have busy lives and other things to do. So we haven't left it, I don't think. It's still there. I believe what you read in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, are largely true, accurate, and if they're not, they apologize, despite Sarah Palin and her suit. But that's the case. It's still there, and Brianna is going to find a different world with more options, but fewer obvious routes. Not the path that maybe several people in this room followed. That seemed to make sense at the time. Yours is a different world.
I was just going to bring up the issue.
Tom Marquardt.
Thank you. I was going to give up the issue of Palin, given what's happening with the New York Times now. I mean, in the first round, it looks like they prevailed. The newspaper did. But if it goes to appeal, and a couple of Supreme Court justices have indicated they're willing to take another look at Sullivan, what's the consequence?
Well, it's hard to say. I've been reading the same articles by Jeremy Peters in the New York Times and others about the very interesting Sarah Palin defamation suit against the New York Times that was ultimately thrown out dismissed by the judge, and the jury went to deliberation and ruled against Palin, saying in effect the New York Times did not fulfill the requirements of defamation or libel as defined by New York Times versus Sullivan, and which is the so-called settled law. What Sarah Palin and her lawyers succeeded in doing was bringing all that into question. Will an appeal, her case is pretty weak. An appeal, I think, would be dismissed and be rejected by higher courts. I don't think it'll be taken up, but she has opened, she and her lawyers have opened the door to that whole question of the independence of the press and their ability to make mistakes.
Phil, last question, please.
Phil Jones.
I want to know if you share any of my frustrations as a retired journalist. There are many times, almost every day, that I'm sitting in my apartment, watching TV, reading, so forth, and I'm looking at what is covered and what is not covered. And I'm ashamed. I mean, what has been happening with the press, they just flat out decide, say for example, CNN decides it's not going to cover something. So it's never mentioned. Back in my days as a journalist, if there was a story of question, CBS went after it to try to figure out whether it was right or wrong. Now, you don't see that.
No, they still do. Great question. It's a very valid question, and it's all too often true, what you're saying. But you're citing CBS, the organization both of us worked for. They still try very hard to get it right and get it on the air. The economic pressures on the business of network television especially are much greater than they used to be and are limiting in their ability, their time, their opportunity, and capacity to do what you're talking about, which is to get the real news on the air. Excuse me, forgive me, on the air.
Well, the only place I have seen this is, for example, PBS and Frontline. They recently did a story on COVID and how it happened. It was fantastic. Every American should see this. Nothing like that is done that I have seen on American television.
Frontline, Tuesday nights, 10 o'clock,
Yeah.
PBS, outstanding. Extraordinary work. Greg Wrench,
I'd like to ask one quick,
Well, you brought it here, you go ahead.
one inside baseball question, Terry. What is it about the New York Times that allows it to get so many exclusives? When I was a young reporter, I'd call a source, no comment, can't call you back, blah, blah, blah. The next morning, New York Times exclusive, the same story I asked about. Now, I was with a small Chicago paper, but do you guys work harder? Are you smarter? You know, do
do I
you
hear
pay
those sour
more?
grapes there? You know, obviously, you have a great advantage when you call somebody up and you say, you're so-and-so from the New York Times. They might take your call when maybe, and apparently they didn't take yours. But it doesn't mean they won't try to push the agenda and sell you a line of stuff. So, I mean, I don't think that's changed. I don't think that's different. In Israel, where I spent a total of 5 years as New York Times correspondent, you are closely read. And let me tell you, if you stumble, you'll hear about it right away. You know.
Please join me in
Thank you.
thanking our wonderful